Greetings from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Kamraval. One of the biggest puzzles in terms of Iran's most recent elections is the shape that Iran's relations with its neighbors will take. Today, helping us navigate Iran's interregional dynamics is probably one of the best experts on the topic, Dr. Banafsheh Keynoush. Dr. Keynoush will join us in looking at Iran's regional policy. Her lecture will explore a wide range of topics that describe how Iran's neighbors, including the states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, countries in the Levant and Turkey, view their ties with Iran. These are some of the topics that Dr. Keynoush has explored in her latest book, Iran's Interregional Dynamics in the Near East, a book that has just been released. In the book, Dr. Keynoush and colleagues provide a comprehensive guide that help broaden our understanding of Iran's relations with regional neighbors. The book is the product of a roundtable that was convened at Princeton University by experts who either live in the region or have had extensive experience working in the region. Banafsheh Keynoush is a scholar of international affairs, and she's the author of the highly acclaimed book, Saudi Arabia and Iran, Friends or Foe. The book was published in 2016 by Palgrave Macmillan, has been translated widely, and is one of the most widely sold books on Iran. Dr. Keynoush has conducted fieldwork in the Middle East for 2 decades, including in Saudi Arabia and in Iran, and she was also a visiting fellow at Princeton University, as well as a visiting fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh. She's the president of Mideast Analysts, an international geopolitical consulting firm. Dr. Keynoush received her PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and completed joint degree courses at Harvard University. Thank you, Banafsheh, for joining us today as part of the Iranian Studies lecture series. Before we begin, I'd like to remind our audiences that they can submit questions through the Q&A function in Zoom, or you can comment on the live stream post as part of the Arab Center's social media platform. Dr. Keynoush has agreed to speak for about 30 minutes and then has kindly agreed to take some questions afterward. So without further ado, Banafsheh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamraval, for introducing me, for hosting me today, and for allowing me to join your incredibly prolific center, the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies and the Iranian Studies Unit. I want to take a moment to also thank all your colleagues behind the scene who've made this event possible, including Ibrahim. I had the privilege of meeting right now, the technicians, Hamid Dorzai, and also the interpreters, which I know work very hard to make this event happen. So shukran jazilan, thank you to everyone. Mamnoona. It's a pleasure to be here, and if you allow me, I'll go straight into the topic of Iran's interregional dynamics, specifically in the Middle East, the closer Near East region, excluding Yemen for now and North Africa, which are broader topics. And of course, I would welcome questions on those regions, but I will limit my conversation to Iran's immediate neighborhood and explain why I believe, unlike popular conception, that Iran's influence in this region cannot be taken for granted. And Iran does not possess unbridled and unhindered levels of influence in the region. As a matter of fact, if we look at the individual case studies of Iran's bilateral relations within its immediate neighborhood, And if we really observe what Iran's neighbors do in terms of handling their relationship with the country, we notice that Iran's influence is in fact piecemeal. Iran builds its influence on a piecemeal basis, step by step. And like any level of influence, it at times has achievements and at other times has setbacks. Now, with that brief introduction, I'll dig into the general hypothesis of my discussion. Within Iran's immediate neighborhood, we have the Gulf Cooperation Council, and we have the periphery, the so-called, colonial designation of the periphery states of Israel and Turkey, of which Iran is also a member, given that they are not the core Arab countries of this region, and the Levant. Within this geographic scope, the countries in the region that are codependent for their security on the United States or among themselves have lesser ability to enhance their ties with Iran. And that means that they are far more reluctant to allow Iran to build influence within those countries. And here I'm speaking primarily of the Gulf Cooperation Council states. Countries that have historically pursued independent foreign policies like Turkey and Israel have basically adopted an approach toward Iran in which they engage with Iran only as long as Iran meets their interests. So Iran matters to Turkey and Israel only to the extent that Iran is able to help those two countries meet their own interests. It's a very compartmentalized approach to engaging with Iran. Within the other parts of the region, including the Levant, and especially the conflict-prone parts of the region, such as countries like Syria and Iraq, Iran has had the biggest influence and the biggest opportunity to influence those regions. But even so, the policy that Iran has pursued has been risky and costly, not only for Iran, but also for its neighboring countries. With this introduction, I want to now focus first on Iran-GCC relations. Within the GCC, as we know, we have 6 Arab countries that border Iran. Generally, all of them have a security approach toward Iran and toward handling their relationship with Iran. Among these 3 countries, there are 3 that are able to really have carve out a relatively independent path in their foreign policy when it comes to handling Iran. And that is, those are the countries that really do not have a so-called sectarian concern with Iran. They do not need to heed too much the issue of Iran's Shia influence within their territories. And here I'm speaking of the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Qatar. This is not to say that they are not aware and conscious of some of the sectarian challenges within the region, or broadly speaking, or with respect to Iran on a bilateral basis. But really for them, their relationship with Iran is defined within a security parameter. And within that security parameter, Iran is only a tertiary factor at best. Their primary concern are inter-regional dynamics among the 6 GCC countries and with the United States and with world powers. So Iran really rests third. And how Iran is a tertiary really influencer with the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Qatar is pretty straightforward. These 3 Arab countries have their own security concerns. And they navigate that by broadening their security partnerships, be it with the United States, being with other countries, or within the GCC. They also have economic interests that are not readily available to Iran. Their economic interests lie elsewhere. So, in the case of the United Arab Emirates, its wide investment arena indicates that Iran is one investor in that country or potential investor in that country, but not the only one. In the case of Qatar, Qatar has other investors and has other investment interests. Even during Qatar's blockade, when a popular conception indicated that Iran-Qatari relations would enhance on the economic front, our findings in this book indicated the reverse. For a brief point of time, the economic relationship between Qatar and Iran did increase, but Qatar's need for diversification meant that it had to focus on local production in order to overcome the blockade, and then to seek stronger economic partners other than Iran, such as China, Japan, Turkey, and elsewhere. In the case of Oman, Oman has had long partnerships with India, within the GCC, and of course with the West. And if we look at the economic partnership between Oman and Iran, while Oman is interested in Iran's energy potential, it really has not fully materialized in terms of building a steady energy partnership between the two countries. In the case of the United Arab Emirates, the Emirates' re-export capacity does matter for Iran. Iran investments do matter for the United Arab Emirates, and the United Arab Emirates tries to bring that calculation into its economic partnership with Iran. But at the same time, it does not allow that to dominate the UAE security concerns vis-a-vis Iran. Then we have the other three countries of Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain, which are more concerned about the issue of sectarianism within the region. Within that parameter, what Bahrain has served as a buffer between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but Bahrain is also beholden from an investment point of view to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And Bahrain has sufficient security tensions with Iran to prevent Iran from really building a strong partnership with Bahrain. Kuwait has economic interests within its 2035 vision that involve building a stable region and working with Iran and Iraq. But beyond that, Kuwait does not have any immediate economic or security interests that are tied with Iran. And as a result, Kuwait is more interested in building its own domestic security, especially among its Shia community, and trying to accommodate them and incorporate them within mainstream Kuwaiti politics in order to keep Iran at bay. In the case of Saudi Arabia and Iran, regional tensions, as we know, have prevented them from coming together and building a balanced relationship. As a result, any effort within the region to build multilateral relationships between Iran and its Arab neighbors, including Saudi Arabia, has failed to date. Saudi Arabia and Iran have developed their own counterterrorism policies. They've developed their own approaches to sectarianism or desectarianization. They've pursued niche diplomacy in other areas, but also on terrorism, sectarianism, proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation, but they have really not worked together. When they have tried to dominate the region, Saudi Arabia has failed, but so has Iran. Iran actually tries to say that it does not seek to dominate the region. It is not a hegemonic power. But the reason they are unable to build up their power and resolve the conflicts between them is because of a fundamental imbalance of power between them. So within the GCC landscape, Iran's influence remains limited. Turkey has developed a compartmentalized approach to building its relationship with Iran. It is concerned by Iran's actions in Syria. It has economic interests with Iran. It has to resolve the Kurdish challenge between Iran and Turkey at any given point of time. And so rather than making Iran a big problem for itself, what Ankara does is pick policies that it wants to engage with Iran at the level that Ankara determines, not at the level that Iran wants, and then let it be. It's a very compartmentalized policy. One moment Syria, the next moment the Kurdish issue, the next moment energy issues, a minute later Iraq, but there is no strategic partnership that has formed between the countries, although strategically they understand that they are neighbors and they have to accommodate each other to an extent. By the same token, Israel really has not picked up a fight with Iran because it's a direct fight with Iran, because such a high level of confrontation is costly to Israel. But Israel has also taken measures to contain Iran through, military strikes here and there, through threats here and there, through promises of containing the Iranian nuclear program here and there. But then again, how Israel perceives Iran is in a manner that Israel security interests must at all times be met. And so again, it deliberately decides what its policy engagement with Iran within also its immediate neighborhood is in Palestine, elsewhere. Iran's influence in Jordan, in Palestine is not as large as we imagine because of the heavily securitized nature of politics in that part of the region. In Iraq and Syria, Iran often engages in para-diplomacy. It uses its allies and gives them a seat in diplomacy, either by enabling them to negotiate with the central government, as in the case of Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Hashd al-Shaabi in Iraq, by helping them gain a voice in Iraqi or Lebanese parliament or cabinets. But para-diplomacy has limits as well, because it confuses Iran's relationship with the central governments, with Beirut, with Baghdad, even with Damascus. And all three capitals, while they recognize the need to engage with Iran, they also try to be selective in how much they allow Iran to engage with them on an economic front, etc. And I will be happy to dig deeper about this. But I want to bring this conversation forward to what is facing us with respect to Iran now. We are post JCPOA in a way, the nuclear agreement that was concluded between Iran and the world powers in 2015. We're post 2018, the Trump era, when the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions on Iran. And we now have a new government in Iran that is led by President Ebrahim Raisi, who will develop his own, Iran's new policies with respect to the region and with respect to Iran's level of commitment to this nuclear deal. This means that within the region, Iran's neighbors are unclear what steps Iran will take moving forward. How will Iran react, for example, to the inconclusiveness of the nuclear deal? And because the region is unclear about that, that means that the region will not open up to Iran in the foreseeable future in a manner that will lead to steady strategic partnerships. Moving forward, the engagement with Iran will remain piecemeal. It remains to be seen if Raisi's government is able to transform this piecemeal policy into a broader policy of engagement, because it may want to, given that in the United States, President Trump has left and the Biden administration does want to encourage more engagement with Iran, which also eases Iran's regional dynamics a bit. It may also want to do that because it wants a resolution to the nuclear issue. But if we look at where Iran is right now, Iran is increasingly looking inward rather than outward. Iran is trying increasingly to enhance its own capacity for development, irrespective of the outcome of the nuclear deal. That means that Iran is trying to untie its economy from the outcome of the nuclear deal, from the sanctions imposed by the nuclear deal. Iran is developing a host of policies, one example of that being the strategic partnership with China, but also a host of energy policies that will help it build up its capacities internally. So Iran will also continue to engage within the region on a piecemeal approach based on what the region can offer Iran. We might be able to expect a level of de-escalation with Iran, hopefully, given the emerging dynamics and Iran's needs, but that remains to be seen. This is generally the overview of some of the findings of this latest book, for which I also owe a great deal to my contributors, and also some of the developments that have taken place in recent months. With that said, I am more eager to open the floor to a conversation with you and with our audience. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so very much. That was a wonderfully concise yet comprehensive overview of Iran's regional relations and some of the dynamics that govern that those multiple relationships. We have a number of questions, but I was, if I may start with the first question, I was actually quite interested to hear that in your analysis, Iran's relationship with the UAE is less securitized, if I heard it correctly, than its relationship with Kuwait. Because my understanding has been, probably incorrectly, that because of the three islands, because of the pressure on the United States, the pressure by the United States on the UAE, because of the commercial relationship between Iran and the UAE, that relationship has been far more securitized than Iran and Kuwait. But I suppose what your analysis has shown is that Iran-Kuwaiti relationship has a strong sectarian element to it that is not the case in Iran's relationship with the UAE. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct, and it's also the same with Oman and Qatar. It has a muted sectarian element, which then enables countries like the United Arab Emirates to really focus on immediate security concerns with Iran. And what are they? Yemen. Iran did ask the United Arab Emirates to halt the war in Yemen, and the island issue. They've never gone into a war over the island issue, so. It's there, but it's there. And the other major security issue is navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. And the UAE immediately dispatched a naval delegation to Iran to hold talks. Often Iran and the United Arab Emirates hold quiet talks between them to resolve some of these differences. So that tells me that while security elements are present, neither country has an interest to let it get out of hand. If I may just add briefly that in the case of the United Arab Emirates, the country also generally has a policy of maintaining the security benefits of containing Iran when that is the trend, when that is what the United States, for example, wants, when that is a part and parcel of broader GCC policies, but it's also very keen to minimize risks. And throughout its interactions with Iran, it has always focused on both aspects of this of these issues with respect to Iran.
Perfect. Thank you. Our colleague, Dr. Hamid Ali, has a question. Go ahead, Dr. Hamid, please. Sorry, you're muted, Dr. Hamid.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that very interesting conversation. My question is just about the generational shift, the new generation or intergenerational shift that Iran is going through that transformation. And more inclination of the new generation is to settle, more inclined for peaceful settlement, more inclined for the social justice, prosperity, and people are tired of the ideologies. So the question is, is how Iran can sustain this. This is continuing for quite long. The oil was very relevant source of revenue that greasing the wheels for the government to run whatever project they want. But given that also the oil getting less importance because of the different sources of oil and the prices pressure that is going on. So is it sustainable that Iran will continue this or just this is just tactical things? The other question is regarding the geopolitical shift of the U.S. The U.S. is completely now will be focusing on China. That's become clearly the priorities. And the region is going to be less relevant to the conflict that is become very conventional old conflict. So how that dynamic of Iran of the China things likely reflected in this region and particularly in Iran?
Thank you, Dr. Hamid, for these two excellent questions. I haven't done any specific research on the generational issue, but I can tell you that I often, almost on a daily basis, think about it myself, especially in the context of sanctions. I have family and friends in Iran, and they regularly send me pictures of places they go. And I swear to you, Dr. Hamid, what I see is more beautiful than what I see here in the Bay Area in terms of the development, the kind of things that are available, the kind of buildup that has occurred in the country despite sanctions. There is the generational factor, as you point out. The Iranian youth is very entrepreneurial, very eager to remain part of the world and be a major contributor, as we know. But back to your question of the area of your question that I have more sort of expertise on, which is, if I understood you correctly, well, how long can Iran sustain its foreign diplomacy the way it is and not be mindful of the generational shifts that are taking place in Iran? There are two things that are happening in Iran. Domestically, despite a level of suppression and repression that does go on, Iran is also trying to build a generational conversation of its own. And I don't want to get into the details of that. That's twofold. One is a revolutionary generational conversation, giving power and voice to young revolutionaries. The other one is really building a conversation with the non-revolutionary youth in Iran in terms of what nationalism means. What does Iranian nationalism mean to the general population? So Iran is doing that. But Iran can sustain its foreign policy regardless of these generational shifts, because despite sanctions, there are two factors that push Iran's diplomacy. One is the ideational aspect of it, the revolutionary worldview of it that does not die. And it complicates Iran's relationships in the region at all times, as we know. But the second one is the material aspect of it. Iran is still materially a wealthy country. I don't know of any country in the world that could have sustained decades of sanctions and the level of sanctions that Iran has faced and still stand on its feet and not break down. So that, and at many levels, Iran has broken down. Please don't get me wrong. We know that the economy is suffering, but it's still not down on its knees fully. It's still standing on its 2 feet. And so I don't see how generational factors on a domestic level will impact foreign policy. To date, they have not. And Iran is not a kind of country where domestic, in which people have a say in foreign policy. That is not the case. So I hope this answers part of your question. The China dynamic matters. I think to the extent that China can be a stabilizer within the Gulf region, it matters to Iran and all of its neighbors. To the extent that the United States does not destabilize the Gulf region, to the extent that the United States does not contribute to further power imbalances in the Gulf region, that helps Iran and the region in terms of figuring out how to live with each other, irrespective of the United States, which is, after all, what they've done for centuries.
Thank you. Banafsheh, there's a question on Iran's relationship with Oman after Sultan Qaboos. Can you comment on the evolving relationship in political, economic, and diplomatic areas between Iran and post-Sultan Qaboos Oman, please?
I can tell you my understanding of Iran's observation about Oman, and I will admit that I haven't really looked very deeply into this from the Omani side since Sultan Qaboos passing away. Iran is pretty confident that it can work with a new generation of leaders in Oman, and it has a solid relationship with them as well, because Iran's partnership with Oman, diplomatic engagement with Oman, has been going on for 40 years since the revolution. Oman has some energy interests with Iran that it would like to explore if it can, with some help from the Russians, maybe the Chinese. But from a security point of view, Oman does not just have an uneasy time with a country like Iran, given that it's a bigger neighbor. Oman also has an uneasy time within the Gulf Cooperation Council, especially with the United Arab Emirates. As we know, there are some border issues between the two of them. Oman wants a quicker resolution to the conflict in Yemen, just like Iran does. Oman remains closer, obviously, to the GCC in terms of security policies vis-a-vis Iran. And with the United States, Oman will always follow what the GCC and the West generally develop by way of a security trend toward Iran. But within the region, Oman will maintain its interest of engaging with Iran on security issues over lowering tensions along the UAE-Omani border, lowering tensions in Yemen, and lowering tensions in the Sea of Oman, Gulf of Oman, and the Strait of Hormuz. So I don't anticipate a major shift happening. And Oman's leaders are generally, it's not the case that they completely open up to all the leaders in the GCC at all times either. Oman kind of has its own inward way of developing its interests, which always leaves room to engage with Iran. But that's really all I can say. You might want to add something to that.
Perfect, thank you. There are a couple of questions about Israel and Iran, and I know that's a little further afield, but first of all, there's a question: why does Iran get the blame for everything that goes wrong in the region and not Israel? And then I suppose related to that is another question about the importance of balance of power and applying a balance of power prism through which Iran's relationship with Saudi Arabia and Israel can be understood and analyzed. You mentioned the importance of identity as playing a role in Iranian foreign policy. But can you also place that in conjunction or next to this balance of power perspective? Or is that applicable at all?
Thank you for this question. I believe that it is applicable. First of all, on the question of blame, well, when it comes to blame, I think everyone in the region can take a blame for something and should. This is not a fully well-functioning region in terms of building bilateral relationships or strong multilateral relationships. And it's a pity because it has so much to offer to the world. Why does Iran take more blame? Well, we have to ask that from Iran. Why does Iran think does Iran think that it's doing? And then one can ask the question from Tel Aviv as well. So I'll leave that there, but I will tell you more about my understanding of the geopolitical formation of the Israeli-Iranian relationship, for whatever it's worth. historically, these are periphery countries. I mean, let's call it periphery. They're non-Arab core. So whether they talk to each other or not, they have one primary interest that comes first before the tensions between them. And that is to not allow the core Arab countries to gain the upper hand over them. Turkey is also of the same mind on this issue. Because if the core Arab countries team up against any of these three periphery non-Arab countries, then they have real tensions. Israel fought 4 wars with the Arab world. For example, Iran fought one long war with Iraq and many historical wars with the Arab core. Turkey and the Arab core history is rife with conflict as well. So although Tel Aviv and Tehran don't sit down and talk to each other and say, well, let's come up with plans of not letting the Arab core dictate our policies, I think that when they think about how to contain each other, they always factor that no matter what policies they develop to contain each other, they cannot irreversibly damage one another if it allows the Arab core to then dominate the geopolitical calculations of the periphery. Because that is a major security threat to both Israel and Iran and Turkey. And no matter how much they disagree on issues, which is plenty, they have to factor that in. And that explains why Israel has not yet attacked Iran. For the past 40 years, I always tell people who are always ringing the sound bells, oh, Israel's about to attack. I'm like, well, why hasn't it attacked yet? I mean, I kind of get tired of hearing that, because if we formulate our policies based on fear of militarization, when that militarization in the form of a direct attack has not happened, then we're missing an issue here. And that issue is the balance of power. I have worked a lot on it and studied the issue of balance of power between specifically Saudi Arabia and Iran. But I am increasingly of the mind that the same, and we find this in our book, it's part of the finding of this book, that the same balance of power calculations that go into defining the Saudi-Iranian relationship, and for that matter, the Gcc-Iranian relationship, go into Israeli-Iranian calculations, except at a distance. I don't think enough work has been done on this issue. Of what that balance of power entails and how the United States factors into this balance of power calculation. Because in the case of GCC and Iran, the United States has a dominant role in this balance of power. But in the case of Israel and Iran, well, I would say not enough studies have been done, because most studies focus on immediate conflicts, on immediate fear of militarization. So yes, and I'm happy to say that I'm partnering with a team of academics to explore some of these themes in a forthcoming book that will hopefully be out in 2022, and we'll be happy to talk with you more about it.
Perfect, thank you. Now I know we're looking at regional dynamics, but there's a question about Iran's interests or lack thereof in Libya. Does Iran have any interests in Libya, or is Libya not important in Iran's calculations?
Iran has interests in every single country in the world. And it has calculations for every single little island nation in the world. It may not be in our eyes or in our face, but it is shaping. Libya is, I believe humbly, a very important country for Iran. But because it is at a distance, and because it is conflict prone, and because there are wider Mediterranean calculation, policy, security, strategic interests around Libya's immediate neighborhood, because of Western interests in Libya, Iran's primary interest in Libya post-Gaddafi, post-2011, is to make sure that no party in Libya gets an advantage, to get what it wants. Because it's a very simple calculation. If the country is in conflict, then why let anybody get the upper hand over there? So while Iran has supported the central government and any general UN policies of supporting Tripoli, it is It is also the case that Iran has built a conversation with multiple Libyan groups, including the Muslim Brotherhood. Before Gaddafi's downfall, while Iran always engaged with Muammar Gaddafi, Iran actually said itself that it played a critical role in boosting the opposition's position that contributed to the overthrow of Gaddafi. So I can't imagine that Iran does not have interest in Libya. And if we factor the issue of terrorism and Iran's desire to develop a counterterrorism policy in Africa, with Libya being part of Africa, then Iran is certainly watching Libya, but also for that matter, Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, all those borders where groups like the Islamic State or others can operate. Iran will be there.
Thank you. There is a question from Professor Doraj of Texas Christian University, who asks whether the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan has any bearing on the negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran and Saudi Arabia have had these cycles of tension and negotiation over the last 40 years or so. And given that now the United States has withdrawn from Afghanistan, and given that rightly or wrongly, there's a perception here in the region that the Americans are not as interested in the region, do you foresee that having any consequences for the relationship between Iran and Afghanistan? Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Professor Doraj, for that question. Salam. It's really good to hear from you. Afghanistan. There is a potential because historically, since in the past 40 years, Iran and Saudi Arabia have previously engaged over Afghanistan. This goes a long time, for people who are as old as me, remembering that, there was a coalition of the Seven and the coalition of the Eight during Afghanistan's civil war in the late 1980s and 1990s, where Saudi Arabia and Iran engaged. And I remember I was an interpreter at the time, interpreting some of the events at that time. And this is the only reason why it comes to my mind. But having said that, that conversation formed because obviously something needed to be done in Afghanistan in handling the Afghan civil war. And both Saudi Arabia and Iran, to my knowledge, engaged with, for example, Rabbani, who was assassinated. I also interpreted for him for a while. But looking at the geopolitics of the issue, at the moment, they're not exactly, Saudi Arabia and Iran are not exactly on the same side of, let's say, the Afghan kaleidoscope. It's too many players. Iran's policy toward Afghanistan is one of flexibility. It is looking at Afghanistan as a country that may be is dominated by the Taliban. Iran has issues, but has also engaged with the Taliban. But it also is looking at an Afghanistan that might break up because, for example, just like in the 1990s, Ahmad Shah Massoud and now his son Ahmad Massoud is doing some stuff in Panjshir. And Iran must build its coalitions with China and Russia in northern Afghanistan and a little bit with Tajikistan in case something happens and another Afghan civil war plays out. Saudi Arabia is working more closely with Pakistan at the moment on the issue of Afghanistan. Iran has concerns, deep concerns about that. I will not get into the details of it. We can imagine what some of those concerns might be. In terms of Iran's border security, if the Taliban were to radicalize against Iran. And as a result, Iran is holding its own conversation, not with Saudi Arabia, to my knowledge yet, deeply at least, on Afghanistan, but with Pakistan. And so we have to see where that goes. Ibrahim Raisi made it very clear to Pakistan's Foreign Minister, Mr. Qureshi, that Iran does not think that Afghanistan is any longer what it is today, what it was 2 or 3 decades ago in terms of having guardians, the way the Pakistanis were able to navigate through Pakistan. And he made it very clear that Iran will not tolerate it. What that means, I really don't know. I think we all must wait and see. But I think, given the speed of US departure from Afghanistan, all of these countries, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, kind of have no choice but to engage in Afghanistan. And if they do, Qatar also, we have to see what shape that takes. I hope.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much. You spoke of Raisi's foreign policy, at least in relation to Afghanistan. There's a question on the shape of Iran's foreign policy under the new administration in relation to Iran's immediate neighbors. Do you think, the questioner asks, is it a rational foreign policy? But I think that's assuming that the countries of the region themselves have rational foreign policies towards Iran, which isn't necessarily always the case. But do you detect a change in tone and in tenor insofar as Iran's foreign policy towards its Arab neighbors is concerned?
Not everyone will agree with my view on this, so I take full responsibility for it. Iran's foreign policy generally doesn't shift drastically from one president to another. And I think time and again, this has been proven to us. From the beginning of the revolution to now, whether you have a reformist, hardline, moderate, conservative, name it what you want, Iran's general foreign policy approach toward its Arab neighbors, since we're talking about, hasn't really completely changed. Sure, under Khatami, there was a little bit of period of détente. But even if you look at it at that time, not much really happened. A little bit of business here, a little bit of the Saudis invested in a juice-producing company in Iran. And, I mean, seriously, nothing really deep happened. Some security border, terrorism, but nothing beyond that. So talking of rationality, we have reason to believe that the same rationality that has dictated Iran's foreign policy in the past 40 years will dictate Raisi's foreign policy as well. And if we look at his pronouncements, he has actually insisted that he wants to normalize and improve relations with Iran's Arab neighbors. And one of the reasons why he's saying this is that before he became president, in the past 2 years, increasingly Iran's hardliners were very critical of Rouhani's government for not doing enough to reach out to the Arab neighbors. I myself have seen in the course of some, conversations here and there that the Rouhani government was criticized for paying too much attention and becoming too self-confident in the course of the nuclear talks about an opening with the West, to the point of forgetting that, hey, we've got real nice neighbors that we can build relations here first. And the hardliners were mindful of that because they understood that in the absence of a full-pronged success in the nuclear deal, they're going to have to rely on these neighbors to some extent. At the very least, they have to rely on them not attacking Iran, which means that they have to be able to have a security conversation and, to an extent, hopefully an economic conversation with Iran's neighbors. So I believe that Raisi will pursue that policy. Whether he will succeed is a different question, because the region suffers still from an imbalance of power. Saudi Arabia and Iran have to address that to an extent. And Iran, as I said, is increasingly looking inward in building its internal capacities, because it wants to untie its economy from sanctions and everybody else. And to an extent, looking to Asia more than the Gulf region. So we have to see how that shapes things moving forward.
Thank you. I think also important to keep in mind that, at least, for example, insofar as the Saudis concerned, they used to dismiss overtures by Rouhani, saying, well, he doesn't speak for the supreme leader, or Zarif. But now that excuse, I suppose, is gone. And so now given the ideological uniformity within the Iranian political system. There appears to be greater consistency in at least perceptions coming out of Tehran of what Iran is articulating. There's a question, if I may, on Iran's presence in Syria moving forward. And do you see the possibility of a conflict or a clash even between Iran and Russia over the differing interests in Syria?
There have already been some clashes between them, especially over security A and B economic interests. And Russian economic interests have been competing very strongly with Iran's, especially over oil and energy issues, over some of Syria's natural resources, its telecommunication business. And each and every time, almost when Iran has almost tried to conclude an agreement, the Russians have taken over the big deals. Still, Syria is a potential $600 billion reconstruction market. So there's room for everybody, including Iran. And I think Iran is happy enough with that because it never wants to step on Russia's toes. And the reason why Iran can't step on Russia's toes is that Iran has its own projects and plans that it can realize only with Russian acquiescence to an acceptance to an extent. That involves what Iran calls a Persian Gulf Railway that extends from the southern parts of Iran through Iraq and then goes up north and into Syria to build the Syrian market corridor into the Gulf region and from there to Central Asia and elsewhere. The other one is extending these trade corridors to the Mediterranean, to the Bani Yas and other ports that Syria has. Those are areas that Russian security interests are dominant. And I think that there will always be tensions on these issues. But at the same time, Iran has recently become more engaged in the Shanghai organization and as a member, etc. So we have to, I think, in order to understand where Russians and Iran go in Syria, we also have to look at where Russia and Iran go in Eurasia and in Central Asia. And the two will tie very neatly together.
Perfect, thank you. There are two questions that are very similar, so I'll combine them. And they have to do with the departure from office of the Trump administration and the new tone that is being set by Washington, at least insofar as our region here is concerned. And what we see is the appearance, if not the substance, of reduced commitment on the part of the United States to this part of the world. Does that have any bearing on Iran's relations with Saudi Arabia?
It absolutely does. Yes, it absolutely does. And I think the evidence of that is already emerging. I think that traditionally when the United States has tried to deal with the GCC issues, it's either overinvested in Saudi Arabia, as in, some administrations, many are, or when it's decided to withdraw, it suddenly tries to bring in the smaller GCC countries into the fold and give them a more prominent role. And pretty much, I think that this shapes the U.S. understanding of how it needs to approach the GCC and not make it a bigger headache, and hopefully reap the partnership alliance and economic benefits of whatever there is between GCC and the United States. But to the extent that that matters, then what that indicates is that the Saudi position is not necessarily safeguarded either within the GCC or with relationship to the United States at levels that we always imagine. And Saudi Arabia is very mindful of it. That is why it is expanding its own partnerships with Russia, with China, trying to diversify its military purchases from not just the United States, but elsewhere. The importance, there's no denying that the importance of Iranian oil and the importance of Saudi oil is a little diminished for the United States. Now, how that shapes the region, in my mind, reshapes the region is two ways. Either the region has already come to terms with this reality. So either the region builds on areas of convergence and rebuilds the region again, a region that is able to have a level of multilateral engagement that is meaningful enough to sustain the test of time. I'm not just talking about a conversation between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Iraq. No, it has to sustain the test of time, I would say humbly. But either it goes down that path or it goes down the path of conspiracy theories that Iran really likes to entertain a lot. Well, what is the United States up to next after giving us the appearance that it is less interested in investing in the Middle East? Will the United States want to see stronger partnerships, as the Biden administration, I think, would like to promote? Or will there be a time when another future US administration, such as similar to the Trump administration, might come and say, well, we want a great America and everything else that goes with it. And so we need to revisit the map of the Middle East, just as we're revisiting the map of Afghanistan. I would say that Iran is better at planning for the second scenario than the first one, but it's keeping the doors open for the second one. I'll leave it at that. I don't know if I even made sense.
No, you did. You did. I have one final question, and it has two parts. Part one is, can you please tell us about the next book? And part two is, when that book is done, will you please come and tell us about it again in similar fashion that you've done now?
I would be very honored to return. The book is actually an initiative by a colleague of mine, Dr. Robert Mason, who is publishing with Lexington Press a work that re-examines the geopolitics of the Middle East. And I will be one of three contributors. There will be three authors in this book, and Dr. Mason will take the lead. And I think that I am supposed to be working on Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. I hope he doesn't hear this part of the conversation. I haven't started the work yet. But when it comes out, I'll be honored, along with my colleagues, to join you again. And thank you very much for having me today for this fabulous conversation and for the great questions and your very experienced moderation and expertise that you shared.
You're very kind, Banafsheh. My sincere thanks to you for your generosity of spirit, for the time and expertise and comments that you've shared with us. Let me also take this opportunity to thank our audiences here in the Middle East and across the world, and also join Banafsheh in thanking those who worked behind the scenes in making this such a tremendous success. Our translators, our technical team, my colleagues in the Iranian Studies Unit, and the colleagues across the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My sincere thanks again to you, Dr. Keynoush, and to everyone. A good day from Doha.